Dr. Saurabh Datta is professor, as we can see, of neonatology at PGIMR Chandigarh and a professor, adjunct professor at McMaster University, Canada. But I remember Saurabh from when we, as 10th standard students in 1986 in St. Vincent's School, were one day suddenly huddled into the biology laboratory, and our science teacher, with the air of a conjurer, introduced Saurabh, and who was then a student at All India Institute of Medical Science, and announced that he would be giving us a lecture on the central nervous system. So, in addition to being a professor of neonatology, Saurabh is a prolific author. He started with the school magazine and has also written an extremely readable novel, which is set in what is now Bangladesh. He and his wife, Dr. Usha Datta, have been conducting research methodology workshops for a long time on their own, both of them. And I was lucky enough to attend the workshops on two occasions. I will not stand any further between you and him, because he is going to not just instruct but entertain everyone. Saurabh has this unique ability to make any topic interesting, whether it is biostatistics, the central nervous system, a high jump examination in school, or even getting a remark for not doing your homework. Over to you, Saurabh.
Thank you very much, Valentine, for that generous and humorous introduction. You clearly remember a lot of events from school days, which flooded back into my memory. I'm indeed honored to have been invited to give this talk and to participate in this workshop. As you can see, I'm an odd man out. I'm not a nephrologist. I am extremely grateful to Dr. Mohan Rajapurkar, who is like a father figure to all of us, to Atul, who has put in such a lot of hard work to make this workshop a success, to Valentine, my dear friend, for whom every day is Valentine's Day, and to Aniket, who has been the technological brain behind this whole workshop. So it is my unenviable task to keep you awake for the next hour and a quarter, talking about things as dry as bias, confounding, and precision. Okay, so let us start with imagining a hockey series. Hockey, the game of hockey. This hockey series is going to be played to determine which country has a better under 19 hockey team, India or its arch rival country, which will henceforth be abbreviated as ARC. So an unbiased result would be one in which only the skill of the team is associated with the number of games won. You would agree with me. So the predicted variable in this hockey series would be the skill of the team, and the outcome variable would be the number of games won. So to ensure a valid result, the age distribution of the players has to be nearly identical in both teams, right? The ground should be horizontal with changeover at halftime. The linesmen and the referees must be neutral and they should not be influenced by anybody. And the sizes of the goalposts should be similar on both sides. Okay? So with that in mind, the first series between India and ARC under 19 hockey teams was played in India. And this is what the field looked like. As the series progressed, after one match was played, ARC defeated India in the opening match. So the media, which is always ready to pounce on Indian sportsmen, concluded that ARC is better than India. After 3 matches were played in this series, it turned out that ARC had beaten India in the first match, India beat ARC once, and 1 match was drawn. So the media concluded that there is no difference between India and ARC. But then after the full 9-match series was played, you know the results of the first 3 matches, right? The first match ARC beat India. The second match India beat ARC. Third match was a draw. Fourth, fifth, and sixth matches India beat ARC. Seventh match ARC beat India. And the 8th and 9th matches again India beat ARC. So the conclusion was that India is better than ARC. So from this hockey series, what did we learn? We learned that at the end of the 9-match series, it was clear that India was the superior team. But because of random fluctuation in performance, in a given match, ARC could possibly beat India. And if you're going to rely only on that, performance on a single day, you may end up with the wrong conclusion. So the more the number of matches played, the closer we are to the truth, to the true picture as to which is the better team. Of course, having said that, even with 9 matches played, there could still be a random variation in performance favoring India. And one could argue that an even longer series may have thrown up a completely different result. For example, if I say, that 17 matches were played, it may turn out that the result gets completely reversed. But the probability of such a thing happening is less with a 9-match series than with a shorter series. That means the longer your series is, the more number of the matches you play, the more you are likely to arrive at the truth without running the risk of some random variation in performance. Okay, so far so good. Now, a return series was played between India and ARC under 19 teams in ARC. So one was a home series, one was an away series. So what happened in this series that was played in ARC? ARC sneaked in a few players who are more than 19 years of age. ARC influenced the linesmen to be more vigilant when looking at Indian players for fouls. Turned out that the diet did not suit Indian players, so some Indian players fell sick during the match and had to leave the match midway. ARC made the ground gently sloping towards the Indian half, as you can see in this picture, and they insisted that there will be no changeover at halftime. And ARC made the Indian side goal slightly bigger in size than their own goal. Okay, nobody realized all these subtle differences that had crept in, and they went ahead with the series. So what happened? Result of the 9-match series held in ARC. First match, ARC beat India. Second match, ARC beat India. Third match, ARC beat India. Fourth and fifth matches, ARC beat India. Sixth match, somehow India held on to a draw. Seventh match, in a inspired performance, India somehow managed to beat ARC once. Eighth and ninth matches, again comprehensively beaten by ARC. Conclusion was that ARC is better than India. And you can imagine what happened in the media. This is what happened in the media. Headlines the next day. Okay, but what did we learn? What we've learned is that the conditions actually favored one side. Skill wasn't the only thing that determined the outcome. And there were fundamental differences between the teams with respect to the following. Number one, the way players were selected. ARC had sneaked in a few players who were above 19. The way linesmen performed and the way they detected fouls. Extraneous factors like the ground slope that confounded the outcome. The way the outcome was measured, that means the goal size. The attrition in the number of players by the end of the match. India was left with fewer players. So the number of matches played would not have affected the overall result had they gone on playing like this. So instead of 9, had they played 15 match series, they would have had the same result. 21 match series, it would have been the same result. ARC would have gone on beating India. So errors have occurred in both the series that we have seen. So in the first series, random errors were more in the beginning. The errors got minimized by playing more matches. The random error could have occurred in either direction. And before the series, it would not have been possible to predict that the random fluctuation in performance would have benefited which team. Random fluctuation in performance could have benefited either of the two teams. And a small chance of random error would always remain no matter how many matches are played. Someone could always come up and say, well, it could have occurred because of random error. On the right side, the second series that was played in ARC, the errors kept occurring throughout with equal consistency from beginning to end. And errors would not have been minimized by playing more matches because these were systematic errors that pushed the effect in one direction. It pushed the effect in one direction. Before the series, if someone knew what was going on behind the scenes, that person could have predicted which team was going to benefit from the errors because those errors were going to push the benefit in one direction. And the prevention of these erroneous factors, in theory, would have completely prevented systematic errors from happening. This is known as random error, the first part. What happened in the first series. What happened in the second series is known as systematic error, or popularly known as bias. Bias is nothing but systematic error. So let's first talk about random errors, and the concept of precision is associated with random errors. So I'm going to bring in precision because I've been asked to talk about that. So let us start with, I draw your attention to the top part. So remember, in every study, we start off with a hypothesis. Say dexamethasone brings down mortality in severe coronavirus pneumonia. To prove that, we make what is known as a null hypothesis. That means we hypothesize that there is no difference between dexamethasone and placebo in decreasing mortality in COVID pneumonia. And then we go about trying to disprove that null hypothesis. If we are able to disprove the null hypothesis, that means we say the null hypothesis is false, then it means that there is truly a difference between dexamethasone and placebo. So supposing the truth is, could be either of these two. The null hypothesis is actually true, that means there is truly no difference, or it could be that the null hypothesis is actually false, that means there is truly a difference. Now we are doing a study and we are arriving at certain conclusions from our study. If our conclusion is that we have accepted the null hypothesis, that means we also say that there is no statistically significant difference between the two groups, then we are in this box. That means our p-values are more than 0.05. If we reject the null hypothesis, we are saying that there is a difference. That means, say dexamethasone is better than placebo, then we are in this box. Now, how are we performing with respect to the truth? Now, in case the null hypothesis is actually true, that means there is no difference in the performance of dexa and placebo, and we also conclude that it is true, that it means the null hypothesis has been correctly accepted, so all is well. If the null hypothesis is actually false, that means there is really a difference between dexa and placebo, and we also reject the null hypothesis, then the null hypothesis is correctly rejected, then again there's no problem. The problem occurs in the remaining two boxes. Now, if the null hypothesis is actually true, that means there is dexa is no better than placebo, but we reject the null hypothesis, that means we conclude that dexa is better than placebo, then we have committed a false positive error, which is called alpha error or type 1 error. So alpha error is a false positive error, and it's also called type 1 error. On the contrary, if the truth in the universe was that the null hypothesis is actually false, but we accept the null hypothesis, that means we fail to pick up a difference between dexa and placebo, then we would have committed what is called a false negative error or a beta error or a type 2 error. And by convention, the alpha and the beta error are kept fixed at the start of a study. How do we fix the alpha and the beta error? The concept of how much the alpha and the beta error should be finds its roots in law, in jurisprudence. Now imagine that you are members of a jury and you're sitting in a court. Of course, we don't have the jury system in India, but there are many countries where there's a jury system where ordinary citizens sit on a jury and they decide the fate of the accused. So imagine there's a murder trial going on. So there is a person who is in the dock, evidence has been presented, and now you as a jury have to take a decision. Now only the murderer himself and God knows whether he really committed or did not commit the murder. You as a jury have to make up your minds based on whatever is the evidence, or in other words, the sample size presented in front of you. Now, supposing the truth is that the accused is actually innocent, and if you or the judge concludes that the accused is innocent, then justice is done. If the truth is that the accused is actually guilty of murder, and if you, the jury or the judge, concludes that the accused is guilty of murder and sentences him to death, then again justice is done, the bottom right cell. But the problem arises if the accused is actually innocent, but we conclude that the accused is guilty of murder and we sentence him to death, then we have committed a grave miscarriage of injustice. We have committed an alpha error. We have found an association where actually none exists, an alpha error. On the other hand, if the accused is actually guilty of murder, but we conclude that the accused is innocent, we have committed an error, that is a beta error. That means we have failed to find an association between the guilty person and the murder. We have committed a miscarriage of justice, but this miscarriage of justice is less of a miscarriage of justice than the other miscarriage of justice, which is the alpha error. Therefore, the amount of alpha error that you are permitted to commit in a study has been fixed at not more than 5%. The amount of beta error that you're permitted to commit in a study has been fixed at not more than 20% by convention. These are all conventions. Alpha error not more than 5%, beta error not more than 20%. Okay, so how are these errors reduced to this figure? For that, we need to understand the concept of 95% confidence interval. So I'm going to be talking about 95% confidence intervals on this slide. Now imagine that there are a group of investigators who want to find the answer to a question. Say, does dexamethasone reduce mortality compared to placebo in severe COVID pneumonia? They would of course love to do a trial on the entire human population to answer this research question, because that alone would give the single definite truth. But they are constrained to do one small study in one corner of the globe, say the UK, and therefore there is bound to be some margin of error when they are extrapolating it to the whole universe. So they estimate their outcome in their study, and their outcome could be anything depending on the nature of the study. It could be relative risk when one is talking about an intervention like dexamethasone, or it could be sensitivity when one is talking about a diagnostic test, or mean birth weight. So from their study, they get the point estimates, 1.8 relative risk, or sensitivity of 80%, or mean birth weight being 2.6 kilos, which is the data they're getting from their study. To get an idea of the extent of the error, they want to know that if a large number of studies, say 100 studies of a similar nature had been done, within what range of values would 95% of the estimates have been? And they come up with various ranges. Say relative risk of 1.3 to 2.4. Had they done 100 such studies of same sample size, sensitivity of 70 to 90, mean birth weight of 2.4 to 2.85 kilos, and so on. So therefore, there is a 95% probability that the truth lies somewhere within that range of values. And it is this range which is called the 95% confidence interval. So it's not 100, you could say if I did 1,000 or 10,000 studies or an infinite number of studies, within what range would 95% of the values lie? That is the 95% confidence interval. So the authors could not pinpoint a single value as the truth, but at least they gave the readers a pretty good idea of where the truth might lie. Going further, so our study will yield a specific value for an outcome, say RR of DEXA is 0.6 or mean birth weight of 2.5 kilos. We cannot expect the true value in the population to happily coincide with our study. So depending on the margin of error made when drawing the study sample, the true value could lie above or below our study's value. That range of values, including our study's value, which with 95% certainty includes the true value in the population, is the 95% confidence interval. So example, 95% CI of RR, as I said in the previous slide, 0.4 to 0.8, 95% CI of mean birth weight, 2.4 to 2.5 kilos. Showing it graphically. Suppose we do a study to find out the mean birth weight of newborn infants. We want to know what is the mean birth weight in the entire population, but we do a small study in our own institution and we arrive at a figure of 2,500 grams. Using standard formulae, statistical package calculates that given our sample size, the 95% confidence interval limit is from a lower bound of 2,410 grams to an upper bound of 2,590 grams. So what are we saying in effect? We are saying that there is a 95% probability that the truth lies somewhere in this range, 2.41 kilos to 2.59 kilos, but we can't be sure exactly where. The truth could be lying anywhere within this range, 95% chance. And there remains a 5% probability that the truth lies either above 2,590 grams or below 0.2410 grams. But again, we can't be exactly sure where. But there's a 5% chance. Just demystifying the confidence interval again. So supposing this horizontal dashed line is the truth, the true value in the population, which we will never get to know. Only God knows the truth. Supposing 100 studies like ours are conducted, then, and imagine there are 100 studies here. I know they're not actually 100, but imagine that there are 100. So 95% of the 95% confidence intervals will end up encompassing the true value. So all these black studies, the central black dot being the point estimate that they got from their study, and the vertical line meaning the confidence interval of that study. So 95% of such studies will end up including the truth within the confidence interval. That means from the lower point to the upper point of any of these confidence intervals, the truth line will happen to go through the confidence interval. But there will be 5% studies shown in red whose confidence interval will not include the truth. And we will never know whether we are one of the black studies or one of the red studies. So there's a 95% chance that our confidence interval will include the truth, but there is a 5% chance that it may not. Now there's a relationship between the 95% confidence interval and the sample size. All formulae for the width of 95% confidence interval of all parameters that we deal with in biology have sample size in the denominator. That means the width of the 95% confidence interval is invariably inversely related to the sample size, which means the larger your sample size, narrower will be your confidence interval. The smaller the sample size, wider will be the confidence interval. And the narrower the confidence interval, the more precise becomes the estimate of your estimate within a very. So how to deal with these random errors, the alpha error and beta error, which seem to be an invariable part of research? You can't get away from some amount of random error. Let's take this example. Supposing we are doing that, dexamethasone versus placebo study. The null value relative risk is equal to 1. That means the risk in DEXA and placebo is the same. So risk in the DEXA arm divided by the risk in the placebo arm will be equal to 1 because both the risks are the same. So that is shown by the green line here. The blue line shows the actual true RR, say 0.8. That means it favors dexamethasone because dexamethasone is in the numerator, placebo is in the denominator. Risk in the dexamethasone arm divided by risk in the placebo arm is say 0.8. Supposing we are doing a long study. So this is the start of the study. At the left, increasing number of subjects are getting recruited. And here is the end of the study. The planned sample size gets recruited out here. Now, what is happening over the course of the study? Let us look at what is happening to random errors over the course of the study. This red line shows the relative risk that is happening over the course of the study at any given point of time. So the relative risk over the course of the study is actually fluctuating. Let's see exactly what is happening. So at point A, if you had terminated the study here instead of going all the way till the end of the study, you would have picked up the relative risk as being by random chance more than the value of 1. Because relative risk keeps fluctuating around the true value as the study progresses, and the fluctuation keeps reducing and reducing, becomes closer and closer to the true relative risk. So at point A, very early in the study, you would have had a very wide confidence interval because the sample size you would have recruited would have been very little by then. And by random chance, you may have actually arrived at a result that was the opposite of the truth. You would have concluded that dexamethasone is worsening mortality compared to placebo. The relative risk was more than 1 at this point. Had you terminated the study at point B, instead of going all the way to the full sample size, just by random chance, you may have picked it up the relative risk at this point, which was way below 0.8. You would have thought that, oh, dexamethasone is a great drug. It's huge reduction in mortality. And now with a narrower confidence interval, because by this time you have recruited a bigger sample size. At point C, supposing you had terminated the study, bingo, you would have been lucky and managed to actually capture the truth, but without really knowing it. And now you have a smaller confidence interval, but remember the confidence interval is still crossing the value of 1, growing from above 1 to below 1. Point D, again by random chance, you would have been at the crest of this curve, and you would have picked up a relative risk which was very close to 1, but now with a very narrow confidence interval. Finally, at point E, where you terminated the study, you picked up a true relative risk, a relative risk in your study, which was say 0.7, means slightly lower than 0.8, and with a narrow confidence interval, that means with great degree of precision, you can say that the truth lies between this upper and lower bound of the confidence interval. And it is way below the null value of 1. So you're reasonably certain that dexamethasone is superior to placebo. So the solution for reducing the random error that you can make during a study is by recruiting an appropriate sample size. So sample size is the way to deal with random errors. The smaller your sample size, as you can see in the earlier points A, B, C, D, the greater is the chance of randomly arriving at a false result, which is not the truth. Okay, a little more about 95% confidence interval and the concept of precision. Now here I'm going to be talking about 6 imaginary studies. At the bottom you see we're talking about relative risk RR. The null value of relative risk is 1. That means at a RR of 1, there is equal risk in the dexamethasone arm and the placebo arm. To the lower side of 1, it favors dexamethasone on the left side. Higher side of 1, it favors placebo on the right side. Okay. Now let's look at study number 1. Focus on the top horizontal line. So the central dot is the relative risk that you get in your study, and the entire length of this black line is the complete width of the confidence interval from the lowest bound to the highest bound. So in study number 1, the point estimate of the study, the relative risk that you get from this study, the black dot, suggests that it favors placebo because it's on the right side of 1. But look at the confidence interval. It crosses the value of 1 and goes to the other side. And since I said the truth could be anywhere in the confidence interval, the truth could jolly well be sitting on the left side of this vertical of 1. So that means the truth could actually be less than 1. So this is a study which is inconclusive because your confidence interval is crossing the level of 1 and the confidence interval is very wide. So that means it is an imprecise estimate. So it is inconclusive because it is crossing the value of 1, and it is also imprecise because it is very wide. So the truth could be anywhere from highly favoring placebo to moderately favoring dexamethasone, and you can't be certain where exactly the truth is. Look at study number 2. Study number 2 definitely favors placebo. That means it is saying that dexamethasone is worse than placebo, and it is saying it with great precision because the width of the confidence interval is very narrow. And there's a huge magnitude of effect. It is very far away from the value of 1. So that means the RR must be very big in this case. Look at study number 3. Again, it's showing a sizable effect because the RR is far away from the value of 1. This time it is favoring dexamethasone over placebo and with a very narrow confidence interval, which means that the estimate of the relative risk is very precise in study number 3, just like study 2, but except that it's in the opposite direction. Study number 4, it is favoring placebo, but note that the confidence interval is completely on the same side of 1. So even at its most conservative estimate of confidence interval, it is above 1. That means it's favoring placebo. But the trouble with this study is that it's a very wide confidence interval. So it's an imprecise estimate. And the confidence interval comes perilously close, too close to the value of 1 for us to feel confident about. Unlike study number 2, because the truth could be anywhere in the confidence interval. It could be sitting at the lowest bound of the confidence interval. That means it is just a wee bit more than 1, which is not very convincing. Study number 5 is a mirror image of that. It's favoring dexamethasone, very imprecise because it's a wide confidence interval, and the one bound of the confidence interval is coming very close to the value of 1. So it's again not very convincing. And study number 6, the relative risk is bang at the value of 1 with an equal amount of confidence interval on both sides. So that is again inconclusive, very much like study number 1 on top. So study number 1 and 6 are similar in that sense, that they are inconclusive, imprecise. Study number 2 and 3 are both conclusive and very precise. Okay, so that's about confidence intervals and the concept of precision. So the distance your confidence interval is away from the null value, that is called the effect size in the study. So this has a very big effect size, and the width of the confidence interval is known as the precision of a confidence interval. Okay, now having talked about random errors and precision, we now move on to the second type of error, that is bias or systematic errors and confounding. So as I told you before, remember that hockey match between India and ARC and the kind of biases that happened? Okay, now let's talk about the direction in which bias pushes the result. So you know that talking about the hockey series again, look at the bottom of this slide. The null value would have been no difference in proportion of matches won by India and ARC. That would have been the null hypothesis, that there is no difference between India and ARC. Suppose the truth is this green dot here, that means India is better than ARC. That means greater proportion of matches won by India is on the right side of this arrow, and on the left side is less proportion of matches won by India. So that means on the top, it's the result of the hockey series favors India as being the better team. That would have been a conclusion. And had the arrow pointed the other way, the result of the hockey series favors ARC. Now, which are the ways in which bias can work? So bias can actually push the truth towards no effect. That means there is no difference between the two groups. That is one way. An extreme example of that would be if it pushes the effect all the way to the other direction. That means less proportion of matches won by India. So severe bias may push towards the opposite effect. That means instead of concluding that India is the better team, you end up concluding that ARC is the better team, as happened in our example. And of course, there is a third possibility, that the bias pushes to exaggerate the true effect. That means it is on the side of truth, all right, but it gives an even more exaggerated effect of the truth. That means it says that an even greater proportion of matches was won by India. Of course, that would never happen because India is such an honest and law-abiding team that they would never do a thing that would exaggerate the true effect, because they already know that the truth is that they are better than ARC. So there are three ways in which the bias can push the effect. Now, these are the major types of bias, and I would like you to focus on this slide because we're going to be talking about this slide over the next few slides. So the major types of bias can all be classified under three: selection bias, ascertainment bias. Ascertainment bias means when you're trying to ascertain the exposure status or the outcome status of a patient. And the last is known as confounding. Some people call it confounding bias, that it's a kind of bias. So selection bias, ascertainment bias, and confounding bias. And within selection bias, there are a huge number of biases. I am going to be talking only about 4 today that we sometimes find in observational studies and randomized controlled trials. The first is called the admission rate bias. The second is allocation bias. Third is volunteer bias. And the fourth is spectrum bias. And no need to get confused. We'll be talking about all these 4 with examples. So these are types of selection bias. Ascertainment bias, that means you're trying to ascertain the exposure or outcome status of a patient. Very common: recall bias, outcome measurement bias, detection bias, that means how do you detect the patient has had an outcome, and missing data, or in other words, attrition bias, where there is an attrition of patients from the study. And confounding, like any other bias, can be also positive or negative, just like any bias can be a positive bias or a negative bias. Okay, now let's take these one by one. Let's start with admission rate bias, and I'm going to walk you through examples. Supposing a patient presents to the outpatient department or emergency of a hospital with only gallstones, then he or she has some chance of hospital admission. You would agree. If the patient presents, if patient with only diabetes, again, there is some chance of hospital admission. But if there is a patient who happens to have both gallstone and diabetes, there is a very high chance of hospital admission, because most of us clinicians, we have a very low threshold for admitting patients who have multiple problems, multiple comorbidities, and so on and so forth. There may not actually be any association between gallstone and diabetes, but all those patients who happen to have both will all get preferential admission in a hospital. When that keeps happening systematically over time, if you happen to do a hospital-based case control study with the objective of finding out, is there an association between diabetes and gallstones? That means, is diabetes a risk factor for gallstones? You would end up wrongly concluding that there is an association between diabetes and gallstones, just because disproportionately there seem to be so many such patients who have both diabetes and gallstones, compared to gallstone alone and diabetes alone. And that is because of the way admissions are made into hospitals. So what is the prevention for this problem? The remedy for this is either do a community-based study where admission into a hospital is not the criterion for studying, or you also include all those gallstones and diabetics in your OPD or emergency department that were not admitted. So that means you track them down, who all were not admitted, and you include them. Then you will get a true picture of whether diabetes is truly related to gallstones. I mean, this case control study was actually done in the 1950s with a wrong conclusion, and then that was overturned later by better studies. So much about admission rate bias. What about allocation bias? Allocation bias sometimes happens in randomized controlled trials, but it can also happen in cohort studies. Now, who is this guy seen in this cartoon? He is part of the research team, not the main investigator, but maybe a resident or a research staff. And what he has in his hand is an envelope, a serially numbered, opaque, sealed envelope. Now, as it turns out, it's not as opaque as everyone thought it was, because as soon as he held it against a light bulb, he could see that treatment B was written in the slip of paper which was inside the envelope. So he knew exactly what the next patient was going to get. So in a randomized control trial where we put the allocation in slips of paper inside envelopes and seal them, and the envelope is supposed to be opened only after the patient is enrolled and has given consent, here this person is sabotaging the trial by having a sneak preview of what is inside the envelope from beforehand, before even the next patient could be enrolled. So this is known as non-concealment of allocation. Now let us suppose a situation that the research staff is all biased in favor of the new treatment, which is called treatment B, as opposed to treatment A. So they want the best patients, they are hoping the best patients get into treatment B arm, and the not so good patients get into treatment A arm. So let's see how this whole trial can be wrecked. Now, if the next eligible candidate, means the patient, looks like he or she is likely to have a good outcome, that means no comorbidities, younger patient, otherwise, relatively fit, then this is how the investigator will go to take consent. Syrupy sweet, at his smiling best, will try and take consent from that patient. If, on the other hand, the next eligible patient looks like he or she is likely to have a bad outcome, elderly patient, lot of comorbidities, doesn't look like he or she is going to make it, then what happens? In the process of taking consent, this is how the investigator will take consent. By just your body language and the way you take consent, you can either entice a patient into getting into a trial or dissuade a patient from getting into the trial. And that bias starts playing itself out if you already know beforehand what the next patient is going to get, by creating an allocation bias because of non-concealment of the allocation. So this is prevented by ensuring that you have tamper-proof, opaque, sealed envelopes which do not show what is inside the envelope even when you hold it against a tube light or an X-ray view box. So this is the famous tube light test for serially numbered opaque sealed envelopes. Now let's talk about volunteer bias. So here are two individuals. As you can see, they are both obese. Look at their waist hip ratio, their abdomen, they're both obese. Now clearly, one of these guys looks more motivated than the other. Now imagine a research center sends out a public invitation, maybe notices put up on notice boards in a hospital or wherever, invitation to participate in a study on diet modification and obesity. Those interested may kindly apply. Now there are no prizes for guessing as to which of these two people on top is going to turn up for volunteering in this study. So people who volunteer to take part in research are usually far more motivated than the general population. And therefore the results on a study done on them, volunteers, often cannot be generalized to others. And people have burnt their fingers several times with these volunteer-based studies. Remember, even now, the COVID vaccine trials are going on in volunteers, you know, fairly healthy people who are volunteering to take part. And you never know whether the results of all those vaccine trials will be applicable to the elderly whom you are actually trying to protect with your vaccine. So how do you prevent volunteer bias? You prevent it by stratifying your subjects who represent the entire spectrum of patients. That means young motivated patients as well as those who are not so motivated. So you have to do a stratified inclusion of patients into your study so that they represent the entire spectrum of the population. Spectrum bias, the next bias. Spectrum bias typically occurs in a diagnostic test study. And I'll show you how it happens. It's a very common bias that creeps in diagnostic test studies. Now, if one separately recruits very sick patients and compares them with absolutely healthy controls, supposing you're doing a diagnostic test, whatever, you can think of some example from nephrology. You compare very sick with healthy, then the diagnostic test will show spuriously high sensitivity and specificity, because these two groups are at the complete opposite ends of the spectrum. This is known as spectrum bias. But if you can prevent spectrum bias by ensuring that all subjects, both your cases and controls, have a similar degree of diagnostic uncertainty as you would face in clinical practice. A similar degree of diagnostic uncertainty that you would face in clinical practice. So no patient is either very sick where the diagnosis is obvious, no patient is a healthy control where you're certain that they could not possibly be having the disease. Those are the kind of patients you should enroll in your diagnostic test study. It is then that we will get the actual sensitivity and specificity required for differentiating the disease from its close differential diagnosis. Because after all, that is the purpose of a diagnostic test, to differentiate a disease from its close differentials. The purpose of a test is not to differentiate the obviously diseased from the totally healthy. You're never going to use it for that purpose in real life. So in real life, the test is always used for differentiating the disease from their differentials. Therefore, everybody, the disease, the differentials should have similar diagnostic uncertainty. In other words, they should have the spectrum of patients that present to you in clinical practice where you really need to use the test. Moving on, we now talk about the first example of the ascertainment biases. So recall bias, as I said, is a very common bias in retrospective case control studies. So imagine a case control study on the effect of maternal dietary factors on the development of cleft lip and cleft palate. These are common malformations found in newborn infants, cleft lip and cleft palate. So maternal dietary factors. Now, what do you think is going to happen? A mother who has a child with a cleft lip and cleft palate, about which she is being asked by her friends and family day in, day out, that what has happened to this child, she thinks that I must tell the doctor that the lime pickle I ate before I got to know I was pregnant is the cause of this defect. I've thought a lot about it and I am sure this is the cause of the defect. Whereas the mother who has a morphologically normal child would be thinking, oh, by God's grace, everything went off so well. I have forgotten all about the problems during my pregnancy. So you ask her any question and she seems to have forgotten about it. Whereas you ask the mother of the child who has the cleft lip, she will be remembering things in minute detail. And why is this happening? Because the cases, unlike the controls, keep on about what happened in the past to try and explain the disease. So every little thing is there in their memory. Even things that did not happen, they think has happened in their memory. How do you prevent it? Recall bias. You either prevent it or you detect recall bias by scattering your key question. Suppose there's a key dietary factor that you want to test amongst a host of dummy questions in the questionnaire. The dummy questions will be about factors which you know are surely not risk factors, but you scatter them in your questionnaire and see what the response is like. If for every question that is being asked, the mother is saying, yes, this was associated, I had this, I had that, this kind of food, that kind of food, then you know that she is ruminating and she is trying to associate everything that she ate in the past with the disease in hand. Whereas if she is singling out a particular food item amongst the various dummy food items, then you would have picked up that yes, maybe there is a true association between what she is saying and the outcome. So this is how you tackle recall bias. Measurement bias, again, very common. The person who is measuring the outcome is biased because he already knows the background of the patient. So when the investigator knows which group the patient belongs to, then he or she can become biased while measuring an outcome. This is measurement bias. So suppose there is a new antihypertensive drug being tried against a standard antihypertensive drug. Now this is what is happening in the new antihypertensive arm of the trial. So subjects that are in the new antihypertensive group, the doctor who's measuring the blood pressure, which is the outcome, says, I've taken the BP thrice. I think the lowest value must be the correct one. That's what I will record. Because he knows which group this patient is. He's biased. Whereas subjects that are in the standard antihypertensive group, the doctor who's taking the blood pressure thrice says, I've taken the BP thrice. I think the correct way will be, let me record the average value of these blood pressure records, 3 blood pressure records. That must be the correct value. So many times, even subconsciously without knowing it, these kind of things creep into studies and result in measurement bias. So what is the way to prevent measurement bias? 2 ways. One is you blind the investigator. That means the investigator who's measuring the outcome should not know which group the patient belongs to, whether it's a randomized controlled trial or whether it's a prospective cohort study. And secondly, ensure highly standardized measurement techniques. That means you are allowed to take the blood pressure only once and that's it. You're not allowed to take it further. Or you video record the whole blood pressure taking process. Or what people do is they give fake blood pressure instruments. I mean, not fake blood pressure instruments, but blood pressure instruments that have deliberately inserted 0 errors. And how much 0 error is there is not told to the person who's taking the measurement. Everybody is told that your BP instrument has a 0 error, but you will not be told how much it is. In some instrument, it may be 5, in some it may be 20, some it may be 0, and so on. And they're told, well, whatever reading you get, you have to write it because that is not, in any case, not the correct value. So you might as well write it down. And it is already coded as to which instrument had how much 0 error. That is available with somebody who's conducting the study. So the results are all then back calculated and you get the actual blood pressure values. Okay. So these are the different ways in which you can tackle measurement bias. What about detection bias? Another important ascertainment bias. So imagine in a cohort study where the aim is to evaluate an association between South Asian ethnicity and developing coronary artery disease. So you are dealing with a multicultural, multiracial population and your hypothesis is that those with South Asian ethnicity have a greater risk of developing coronary artery disease. So in this cohort study, the problem may be that investigators may ask for symptoms of coronary artery disease with greater vigilance and have a lower threshold for performing angiography amongst those who look as though they are from a South Asian background. Simply because they already are biased in their heads that South Asians have greater coronary artery disease. Even before the study started, they were biased. So they would tend to have a lower threshold for performing angio, not because they are morally corrupt. Bias does not mean that they're morally corrupt, but they may be genuinely feeling for the patients. They may not want to do angiography and invasive procedure on everybody. So if they're already biased, they may have a lower threshold for performing it amongst the South Asian looking people. Whereas in the group that is not looking South Asian, the investigators may either not ask the history or perform angio with as much interest. So what will happen? They will end up detecting more coronary artery disease amongst people with South Asian ethnicity just because they have been investigated more. This is known as detection bias, where you investigate one group more than the other group and end up detecting more cases, although the other group may also be having equally as many cases. This is known as detection bias. How do you prevent it? You can prevent it by having standardized electronic questionnaires to patients. That means no human interface in asking questions. So maybe a telephonic pre-recorded questionnaire, or you can have highly standardized protocols for investigations. That means it is not left to the individual to decide who should be investigated. The moment somebody answers a particular question on the electronic questionnaire, it becomes a candidate for the investigation. Then you have something called attrition bias or loss to follow-up bias. Let's take an example. In an RCT, comparing an oral drug versus placebo, where the drug and the placebo look virtually alike, I mean exactly alike, not virtually, exactly alike, being given to the drug and the placebo arm. If in the drug arm, 15% stopped following up because although they had responded well to the drug, but they had developed various side effects. So they stopped following up and they were not available for measuring the outcome. Whereas in the placebo arm, 10% stopped following up because they were disappointed with the lack of response. Then what is going to happen? When the proportion of subjects lost to follow-up is different between the two arms, note that it's 15% in one arm, 10% in the other arm, or the reasons for not following up is different. Like one group stopped following up because of the side effects, the other group stopped following up because their lack of response, it introduces bias. Because the kind of patients who are left behind in the trial now are dissimilar for reasons other than the effect of the drug alone. So this is prevented by ensuring minimum loss to follow up in any kind of study, and it is addressed. Suppose you do have some loss to follow up, it is addressed by doing what is known as an intention to treat analysis, and I'm sure that will get covered in some future talk on RCTs, and by comparing the baseline characteristics of the loss to follow up patients with those who stayed on in the trial. If the baseline characteristics are very similar of the loss to follow up versus those who stayed on the trial, you're kind of reassured that there was nothing very peculiar about those who were lost to follow up. It just happened randomly. Okay? But of course, the only way to prevent it is by ensuring minimum loss to follow up. That's the only sure shot way. Otherwise, you will result in some degree of attrition bias. So there are some common types of bias encountered in randomized controlled trials, and they are highlighted in blue here. So there's selection bias, confounding bias, performance bias, measurement bias, and attrition bias. So I'm re-highlighting these because these are seen in clinical trials. What I talked about earlier was all the biases you see in all kinds of studies. So what is selection bias? The difference in the way subjects are selected in two groups, and that one group will perform better than the other becomes a foregone conclusion. Then we have confounding, which I'll talk about a little later. Then performance bias is the two groups are managed differently by doctors and nurses, which changes their outcome. That means they know which group they have been allocated to. So the doctors and nurses become more careful about fluid balance, more careful about electrolyte balance, are more vigilant about sepsis in one group than the other group. So that is known as performance bias. And information is also collected differently in the two groups. Whereas measurement bias is where the outcome, such as blood pressure, which is the key outcome, is measured differently between the groups, and the knowledge of group membership influences how the outcome is measured and labeled. And lastly, of course, is attrition bias. I've talked about it. So how are these prevented in randomized controlled trials? Selection bias and confounding are both prevented by proper randomization and concealment of allocation. So that is the solution for it. Performance and measurement bias are both prevented by proper blinding of the caregivers as well as those who are measuring the outcomes. And attrition bias is prevented by ensuring a complete follow-up and performing an intention to treat analysis. What is this word confounding that we have been talking about? Now let's take a very simple situation. You have two groups, one which is exposed to the risk factor, the other is not exposed to the risk factor. So that means they are unexposed group without the risk factor, exposed is with the risk factor. In both groups, a certain number will be diseased. Say this purple proportion in those exposed to the risk factor, some will remain non-diseased. And this is this purple proportion who are diseased in the unexposed group and the non-diseased in this. Now let us imagine that there is another risk factor which is known to be independently associated with the disease. That means it can itself cause the disease. Can you see this black thing can itself cause the disease? And this risk factor happens to be unequally distributed between the exposed arm and the unexposed arm. So that means this black risk factor, there is more of it amongst the exposed, less of it amongst the non-exposed. And this exposed is capable of itself causing the disease. Then what is going to happen? You will end up having more disease in the exposed arm compared to the non-exposed arm, but that more disease was not because of the exposure. It was because of this third risk factor, the black one. This is a confounder. When there is a third risk factor capable of independently causing the disease and which is unequally distributed amongst the exposed and non-exposed. So is confounding a type of bias? There's a controversy about this. Epidemiologists are for and against calling it a kind of bias. So as I've already mentioned, the confounding is always involves third variable other than the intervention / exposure and the outcome. And the third variable is independently associated with both the exposure and the outcome. Known confounding can be adjusted for at the stage of analysis. So suppose that you have identified a confounder, there are statistical ways of getting rid of confounding. But very important, very, very important. Bias in selection, performance, or measurement, etc., cannot be adjusted for in the analysis stage. Once it has occurred, it has occurred. You can't adjust for it. There's no way to do it. Confounding, you can adjust in the analysis. So as I said, a confounder distorts the exposure outcome relationship. Supposing the truth is that smoking increases the chances of cancer 10 times, the confounder may create an apparent overestimation where it's called a positive confounder. For example, you may land up with a study which shows smoking increases chances of cancer 20 times instead of 10. Or it may create an apparent underestimation that is called a negative confounder. You may end up in a study where the smoking increases chances of cancer only 2 times or does not increase the chances of cancer at all. In fact, sometimes there may be an extreme situation. It may create an apparently opposite effect. You may end up showing that cancer, smoking decreases the chance of cancer. It's a protective factor. You know, so all kinds of extreme things may also happen occasionally, though very rarely. Now let me walk you through an example to understand confounding. Supposing we are dealing with effects of gender, smoking, and a cancer. We don't know which cancer it is, some cancer. Okay. Let's first take 200 males. So here are 200 males, and I'm showing you the data. On the left side are the smokers, right side are the non-smoker males, and the blue bars are the cancer, the orange bars are the no cancer. Now, odds, the meaning of the word odds is those with the disease, that means cancer, divided by those without the disease, that means no cancer. So 29 divided by 131, this is the odds of cancer amongst the smokers. That divided by the odds of cancer amongst the non-smokers. So odds of cancer in the non-smokers would be these 4 divided by the 36. So the odds of cancer amongst the smokers divided by the odds of cancer amongst the non-smokers is the odds ratio. And if you want to work it out, you will find that the odds ratio of this cancer amongst smokers versus non-smokers is equal to 2. In other words, amongst males, smoking increases the odds of developing this cancer 2 times. Now let's take females, the 200 females, again smokers and non-smokers. Blue are the cancer, orange are the non-cancer, and again odds of cancer amongst the smokers divided by the odds of cancer amongst the non-smokers. I have done that calculation, and again the odds of this particular cancer amongst smokers versus non-smoker females is equal to 2. But there are two interesting things which those of you who have observed this graph carefully would have noticed. Two interesting things. One is, this cancer seems to be inherently less common amongst males irrespective of smoking. Why do I say that? See, the combined height of these blue bars amongst the females is greater than the combined height of the blue bars amongst the males. So that means males inherently have this cancer less often, females seem to be having this cancer more often. And that's true both amongst the smokers and the non-smokers. Secondly, smoking is much more common amongst the males. Why do I say that? Look at the number of smokers. This blue plus orange smokers of the males is much more than the blue plus orange smokers amongst the females. So males smoke much more, but inherently they have this cancer less often. So why will this create a problem? This will create a problem if you do a study not knowing these underlying relationships between gender, smoking, and cancer. So supposing I did a study not bothering about male and female, I said, okay, just recruit everybody, whether male or female, 400 people. I don't care how many male and female are there. Just get all these people, 200 male, 200 female. This is a combined effect when you take both males and females, smokers and non-smokers. And now, if you calculate the odds ratio, it turns out the odds ratio of cancer amongst all smokers versus non-smokers is 0.9. That means less than 1. That means smoking is now protecting from cancer. If you were to do the study like this, smoking has protected from cancer. This is an example of negative confounding. Why did it happen? Because in the relationship between smoking and cancer, there was a third variable, that was gender. Male gender was positively associated with smoking, but negatively associated with cancer. So as a result, what happened? There was an unusually large number of non-smokers who developed cancer simply because they were women. And that removed the relationship between cancer and smoking and cancer. It created the false effect that smoking protects from cancer, whereas actually, if you had looked at males and females separately, smoking was increasing the risk of cancer 2 times. So this is an example of confounding. So from our example, you can see that the crude odds ratio is 0.9, but the odds ratio in the male stratum separately was 2. Odds ratio in the female stratum was 2. So when do you suspect that a stratifying variable is a confounder? You suspect it whenever you get what you have seen in our example. The stratum specific odds ratios seem similar and they are on the same side of the crude odds ratio. 2 is on the same side of 0.9. See, had the odds ratio in the female stratum been less than 0.9, that means it was say 0.5 and male was 2, then it could not have been a confounder. But if they are both similar and both are on the same side of 0.9, you suspect that that variable is a confounder, and then there are ways of adjusting for it. So the prerequisites of a confounder are 3 key features. The confounder must be itself independently associated with the outcome. The confounder must be associated with the exposure. That means there should be a different proportion of the confounder in the exposed and the unexposed arm. The confounder must not be simply an intermediate step in the causal pathway between the exposure and the outcome. That means it should be an independent predictor of the outcome. So how do you deal with confounders? There are various ways. At the level of the study design, you can either exclude patients with a potential confounder, or you can do randomization in randomized control trials. The whole purpose of randomization in RCT, one of the major purposes is to make sure that both known and unknown confounders get balanced in the 2 arms. As long as they're balanced, they will not do any damage. The moment that they're unbalanced, they start creating a problem. Second is matching. So you can match cases and controls in cohort studies or case control studies for known confounders, or you can do what is known as stratification. That means you stratify patients depending on the strata of confounders. And I'm sure all of these are going to be dealt with in more detail in future talks. And at the analysis stage, you can do either a stratified analysis, which is what we could have done in the smoking and cancer, that means separately analyze males and females, or a very popular multivariate regression analysis. So to sum up this whole talk, which you have patiently heard for almost an hour now, so there are basically two types of errors: random errors and systematic errors. Random error could be either alpha error or beta error. Alpha error is the probability of falsely picking up a difference that does not truly exist. It is a false positive error. It is the more dangerous of the two errors and is usually capped at 5%. Beta error is the probability of falsely missing a difference that actually exists. So it's a false negative error and it is capped at 20% because it is not as dangerous as the alpha error. The bigger the sample size, less are the chances of random errors of both kinds. Bigger the sample size, narrower is the width of the confidence interval, and so greater is the precision of your estimate. A systematic error or bias results from flaws in the design of the study. They do not result from small sample size. So therefore, systematic errors or bias cannot be reduced by increasing the sample size. It can only be reduced by paying meticulous attention to the design of the study. Bias as a result of this unequal playing field between the two groups is due to improper either selection or ascertainment or confounding. Three major sources of bias. Confounding occurs when a third variable is associated with the exposure / intervention and is independently capable of causing the outcome and is not part of the causal pathway. Confounding can be adjusted in analysis. Other types of bias is usually difficult to adjust for them at the analysis stage. Once they have occurred, they have occurred. You can only apologize for them. You can't really adjust for them. Thank you. With that, I end my talk, and I'm quite happy to take any questions either through the chat or live questions, depending on how Aniket wants to do. I do have a poll, and I would request Aniket to put up the poll before we go on to the questions. I'm able to see the results. Yeah. So in the return hockey series, identify the type of bias. When ARC sneaked in a few players more than 19 years of age, majority of selection bias, which is the correct answer. Selection bias. Allocation bias, which the second highest, occurs in an RCT when after the patient has already been allocated, right? The allocation process has been done, the randomization, you are able to see what the next person is going to get because, you know, like you're seeing through the envelope type of a thing. So the single correct answer was selection bias in this. When linesmen were more vigilant when looking at Indian players, detection bias, yes, that is the correct answer. That when one group is investigated more vigilantly than what you do with the other group and you start picking up, in this case, fouls compared to the other group, that is called detection bias. Absolutely right, those 77%. When some Indian players fell sick and left the match midway, attrition bias, yes, you're right, because they were not able to follow up right till the end of the match. This is known as attrition bias, 93%, you're right. When ARC made the Indian goal slightly bigger in size, measurement bias, 93%, absolutely correct. So it's gratifying to find that most of you all have actually been paying attention to this lecture and didn't fall asleep. So that's wonderful. It's a miracle that I myself did not fall asleep. It was such a long lecture. So I'll now take the questions that have come through chat. Yeah.
Yeah. Aniket, I have compiled the questions. So, like there are quite a lot of congratulatory message regarding the talk and all. So let me go through the specific issues. The first question was given by Abhishek Kumar. He wanted a little more information on intention to treat analysis.
Yeah, so the term intention to treat analysis is in randomized controlled trials. What it basically means is that once a subject has been randomized to a given arm of the trial, that person remains in the trial and that person's outcome is measured and analyzed even if the person did not comply with the treatment. I mean, supposing, say, you're giving an antibiotic that had to be taken thrice a day for 1 week, and there were people who took the antibiotic only for the first 2 days and then stopped taking it because they thought that they had got well or because they had some side effects. They did not comply, but still they should be kept in the trial and the outcome should be measured. The intention to treat also includes if they did not take the drug at all, that means not a single dose of the drug was taken, even then they should be kept and analyzed as intention to treat. They should be kept and analyzed even if they took the opposite drug by mistake. So a nurse went to get the drug, she interchanged the drug, she gave the opposite drug by mistake. Even then they should be kept in the trial. They should be kept in the trial even if the outcome occurred before they could even start taking the drug. Even then they should be kept in the trial. So no matter whether they took the opposite drug by mistake, no matter whether they stopped coming for follow-up in between, despite all these things, they should be kept in the trial and analyzed as according to the group to which they were randomized. That is the meaning of intention to treat analysis. Why is it so important? It is important because if you start pulling patients out of an RCT just because they did not fully comply with the drug, just because, for one reason or the other, you are disrupting the whole process of randomization. That means whoever is now left behind in the trial, they are not in the trial because of a random allocation process. They are left in the trial because there are some others who decided to drop out because of non-compliance, taking the other drug, blah, 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 a whole lot of reasons. They left for non-random reasons. So now the whole randomization process will be disrupted if you exclude these people from the trial. The second is intention to treat analysis mimics real life. See, even in real life, there will be a certain proportion of subjects who will not comply with the full treatment, who will do exactly the opposite of what the doctor says. You want that in a real life scenario, real life situation, your drug should still be better than the placebo, even if there is a certain proportion who don't end up taking the full course, who do all kinds of crazy things, don't come for follow-up, and so on. The third thing is why you need intention to treat is that if you start removing patients and you keep only the ones who faithfully followed the exact protocol of treatment, suppose you stick only to that, your sample size will drop because now you'll be left with less people. You had originally calculated the sample size to pick up a certain effect. Now with a smaller sample size, your study will now be underpowered to pick up the original effect that you had planned to detect. So for these three very important reasons, to preserve the randomization, to mimic real life, and to preserve the sample size, intention to treat analysis is a must in randomized controlled trials. I hope that briefly answers what you wanted to know.
The second question, actually, it was a request from Sumana Vasishta. She was requesting whether the PowerPoint will be provided. Dr. Vasishta, this entire session is recorded and this will be available in the ISN website shortly. I hope that answers your query here. Aniket, there has been quite a lot of feedback regarding the poll. Some of the people were not able to submit the poll. I myself tried doing it from my end. It was not working. So that submit option was not coming. So can you look into that during the next sessions? Yeah. And there is another question that we have actually quite a lot of questions. So there's another question from Dr. Satish Balan. He was asking whether allocation concealment is possible if we are using an IVRS based allocation.
Yeah, it is feasible. It is feasible. So supposing you have, I mean, there could be, see, most there are three broad ways in which you could do randomization and concealment of allocation. The most effective way is when the drug is in a vial or an ampule, or if it's a tablet in a strip, right? And those strips or vials or ampules, whatever it may be, are numbered sequentially 1 to 100, whatever your sample size is. But the contents of those strips or vials, they vary randomly between intervention and control drug depending upon the random sequence. So that means the first patient comes, you hand him over the first strip, which looks identical to all other strips. Now nobody knows whether that strip has the drug or the placebo. The patient takes the full course from that strip. Second patient comes, gets the next strip. Third patient comes, gets the third strip, and so on and so forth. And each strip has either drug or placebo, and it's in a random sequence. So here, because the drug is inside the strip itself or the ampule or the thing, the allocation concealment is ensured by the strip or the ampule itself. Nothing more needs to be done. And if the drug and the placebo look absolutely identical, then blinding will be achieved with no special effort required for allocation concealment. It automatically happens. Now, if you have a treatment which is non-blindable, supposing you are doing a trial comparing hemodialysis versus peritoneal dialysis. Now, there is no way you can blind the procedure of doing hemodialysis and peritoneal dialysis. So in that case, you use the envelope method. Okay. The envelopes will be serially numbered 1 to 100. Once you have enrolled the patient and written the patient's name on the envelope, then you tear open the envelope, see what is inside. It says hemodialysis, patient goes for hemodialysis. If it's not, it goes for peritoneal dialysis. So you have concealed the allocation right till the very end. That means patient has already been enrolled, name has been written on the envelope. Now you are beyond the point of no return. You can't, once you've opened the envelope, you can't say, oh, no, I don't want to enroll this patient, because patient's name is already on it, right? So this is the second way of ensuring allocation concealment. The third way is that suppose on a by a telephonic method or an email method, you contact somebody, a central telephone number, and over the telephone they tell you, give drug A or give drug B. And you have two refrigerators, one containing ampules of drug A, the other containing ampules of drug B. So you are told by phone or by email which of the two drugs is to be given. So you go, you open the fridge, drug A's and drug B's all look similar, so there's no way you can tell which one is what. So you open drug A fridge, take out the ampule, give it to the patient. Next time you're told drug B, you give drug B to the patient. The only flaw in this method is that if either drug A or drug B has any unique side effect, and even one patient gets that side effect, then that whole sequence of allocation concealment gets unraveled, because you will know that all drug A's are this particular drug, all drug B's are the other drug. So it is possible to maintain allocation concealment, and these are the three popular ways in which allocation concealment is maintained. I think a lot of this will be taken in the RCT.
Yes, because most of these things will be covered in the RCT. You have made my job a little bit easier. Thank you anyway. So those are another question.
Are there questions specifically related to bias, confounding?
Yes. I'm trying to, I will actually skip most of the questions related to RCT, and I will actually confine to the questions related to the talk. Ajay Kumar Dhakdal has asked, what is the difference between erroneous variables versus confounding variable?
Sorry, what is the first thing?
Erroneous variable versus confounding variable. What is the difference?
Erroneous variable.
Yeah.
I'm not familiar with this term, erroneous variable. I mean, there are effect modifying variables and confounding variables. Those are the two things that are usually confused. One is confused for the other, an effect modifier with a confounder. But I have never heard of erroneous variable being something that we compare confounding variables to.
I hope such a variable should not be there if the study is properly conceived.
I mean, erroneous means a variable that has an error in it, basically.
Yes.
So,
yeah, next question is how to properly identify and delineate the confounding factor when many variables are included.
Yeah, so, confounding variables also needs you to know a little bit about the biology of the disease. So you should have some prior knowledge of which kind of a variable is likely to affect the outcome, and which, if it is unequally distributed between the two arms, is going to create a problem. So you could actually, based on the biological characteristics, decide that, okay, these are the variables, potential confounders I am going to adjust in adjusted analysis. That means multivariate logistic regression or multivariate linear regression, some kind of a multivariate analysis. The second is, you could actually do what I showed you. That means do a stratified analysis of the odds ratio or the relative risk and compare it with the crude, that means a combined odds ratio and relative risk, and see whether the stratum specific odds ratios and relative risks are falling on the same side of the crude odds ratio relative risk. And do that for each potential confounder and see which ones are actually confounding, and then adjust for those in the analysis.
There's one more question from Dr. Divya Bajpai. I hope actually that should have been already answered. She wanted to know how to know if a variable or a risk factor can be a confounder. So Dr. Datta, would you like to add anything more?
Yeah, so as I said, sometimes it's really difficult because there could be unknown confounders. Like you never suspected something to be a confounder that is acting like a confounder, in which case it is pretty difficult to do anything about it. Secondly, if you suspect that something is a confounder, put it into a logistic regression equation and see whether it is causing a huge difference in the outcome. So that means your unadjusted and adjusted odds ratios, if they are very different from each other, then you would suspect that the things that you have included into the model to adjust, they are actually acting like confounders. So that's the second way. The third is what I told you. That means you look at the stratum specific odds ratios, compare it to the crude odds ratios, and if the stratum specific on the same side of crude odds ratio, you suspect it's a confounder. Fortunately, in most randomized control trials, the process of random allocation itself takes care of all known as well as unknown confounders. Known as well as unknown. That is the beauty of randomization. That even when medical science has maybe not advanced to a point that you have identified something as being associated with the outcome, you don't even know about it, but still it has got equally distributed in the two arms, and its damaging effect as a confounder has been taken care of. So if a thing can be done as a randomized control trial, that question should always be answered as an RCT rather than trying to answer it as an observational study. That means as a cohort or a case control study. This is the advantage of an RCT. Thank you.
Next question is from Sudhiranjan Dash. Sir, can propensity score analysis nullify the confounding?
Propensity score analysis. Yeah. So propensity score analysis is actually it's going to take a long time to explain this, because I don't think is there a way of personally sending a reply to somebody? Because Priyamba, now explaining propensity scores is going to take some time. Sir, and then its role in confounding is going to take even more time, which may not be of interest to everybody. So if you can put me in direct touch with this person, say you send me the email, I can send a reply.
Aniket, kindly note, the center's name is Jyoti Singhal. And Aniket, are you listening? Aniket? I think Aniket is muted. I hope he'll be listening. Otherwise, I'll convey to Aniket.
Yeah, so maybe you can just jot down the person's name and...
Let me note down. Give me a second. Let me note down the person's name. Yeah. Then again, the other question from Radhika C. Radhakrishnan, how does intention to treat analysis reduce attrition bias? I hope actually this can be discussed when we deal with the RCTs.
Okay, fine.
Then the other question is from Akash Pandita. How does selecting a combined outcome affect the sample size? When should we select a combined outcome? Is it justified?
Okay. By combined outcome, I think you mean a composite outcome. That's the correct term.
Yes.
So, for example, like at least in the field that I work in, neonatology, we do a lot of interventions in the early neonatal period, and we want to prevent both death as well as, poor neurodevelopmental impairment, prevent cerebral palsy, and so on and so forth, which are detected by about 18 to 24 months of age. So a very popular composite outcome in neonatology is death and or neurodevelopmental impairment. So that means either of the two, if the patient gets, it counts as an outcome. Okay. Now, one of the advantages of having a composite outcome is that you will end up having more events in your study. So supposing, say, death by itself is a rare event, suppose neurodevelopmental impairment is itself a rare event, suppose cerebral palsy by itself is a rare event, but I make a composite outcome, that death or neurodevelopmental impairment or cerebral palsy, any one of the three is going to count as an outcome, then the number of events occurring in my study goes up. That makes it easier for me to calculate a sample size, because if the event rate is high, I can propose even a small reduction in the event rate, which may be a high event rate. That same reduction in event rate would have been difficult for me to propose if the baseline events were itself very low. So for example, if I'm expecting only, say, 2% mortality in my population, I can't say now I'm going to do a trial to have a 5% reduction in mortality from 2%, because that will end up as being minus 3%, right? When it's an arithmetic reduction. But suppose I say or neurodevelopmental impairment, then the event rate may be possibly 30%. From 30%, I can propose a 5% reduction in this composite outcome and be able to do a study like that, because my events are commoner. The second thing is, you may sometimes have what are known as competing events. That means the occurrence of one event prevents the occurrence of another event. So for example, again, I'm sorry, I'm taking a neonatology example, that supposing my primary interest was neurodevelopmental impairment. Okay. Now, to detect neurodevelopmental impairment in a child at, say, 18 months or 24 months of age, the child should have survived till then. If you're dead before that, then where is the question of the neurodevelopmental impairment? So death acts as a competing outcome. It prevents the other outcome from being measured. So where you have one outcome which is a competing outcome, the way out of it is to combine both of them. So either death or NDI then becomes a common outcome, and it is possible to do a study because you are taking care of the deaths as well. So I hope this answers a little bit about composite outcomes. Yeah, Dr. Priyambada?
There's a question from Dr. Jyoti Singhal. I think actually the answer would have been partially answered. The crude odds ratio should be same as the stratified odds ratio for it to differentiate as confounding. In the given example,
Sorry, Dr. Priyambada, I think I've lost you.
sir, there was some problem with my net connectivity. So Dr. Jyoti was asking is the direction of the crude OR and the stratified OR. In the given example, both ratios were going in the opposite direction. So can it be taken as evidence that there is some confounding variable there, which has gone into the calculation?
So the example that I gave, both males and females had a stratified odds ratio of equal to 2. When you are combining males and females, the odds ratio was 0.9. Okay. Now, whenever you have a situation when in the strata individually, you have an odds ratio which is quite different from the crude's odds ratio, and they're both on the same side. That means both the 2's are on the same side of 0.9, right? Like supposing they were not exactly 2. Suppose males were, say, 2 and females were 1.8. Then still you would suspect that gender is a confounder, because 2 and 1.8 are on the same side of 0.9. However, supposing the males was 2, females was 0.5, then it's unlikely to be a confounder, because 2 and 0.5 are on two different sides of the crude figure of 0.9. Have I made myself clear?
Yes, sir, I hope so. It should be clear now. And there's another question from Sagar. He was asking in the relative risk chart shown what that black dot is suggestive of in terms of size and position over line. So I
Yeah,
think he is referring to that table in which you showed that relative risk.
yeah, those, I think those study 1, 2, 3, 4, 5,
Yes,
6.
yes,
Yeah.
exactly. Yes,
So
yeah.
the black dot was the relative risk that we got from that study. So supposing there is a study in which there are, 100 people in the intervention arm, 100 in the control arm. There are, say, 20 deaths in the intervention arm, 40 deaths in the control arm. Then the relative risk from that study will be 0.5, because it will be 20% deaths in the intervention arm divided by 40% deaths in the control arm. So 20 by 40 is 0.5. So 0.5 would be the relative risk from that study's data. But you are not content with just that study's data, right? You want to know that if I were to extrapolate this to the entire universe, the whole world, where will the relative risk lie? For that, you calculate the 95% confidence interval. So supposing the 95% confidence interval extends from 0.3 to 0.8, with your studies 0.5 lying in somewhere in the middle of that, not exactly in the middle, by the way, but somewhere inside that, then the confidence interval is those 0.3 and 0.8. Your study's value is 0.5. Is that clear?
There's another question from Uma Ali. Should p-value be mentioned when you report confidence intervals?
It is not necessary. Most leading journals, such as the Lancet, JAMA, NEJM, they have stopped reporting p-values altogether. Because if your entire confidence interval is on the same side of 1, then you know that the p-value has to be less than 0.05. There's no other way. And the confidence interval by itself, therefore, gives that information about the p-value. It also gives the magnitude of the effect, because how far is your confidence interval away from the null value. It also gives you the precision of the effect. That means how narrow is your confidence interval. So these are the extra things that confidence interval gives you, which p-value is unable to give you. So
Okay.
most journals have now stopped reporting p-values.
Yeah.
The leading journals.
Next question is again, it's related to RCT by Subha Banerjee. Would it be right to say intention to treat means we are looking at the worst case scenario?
Dr. Priyambada, why don't you take that?
Yes.
In your talk, yeah.
Yeah, I'll cover this, but probably we are actually like a lot of other questions that need to be answered. So I'll actually note these points in my talk. Then there's another question. What is the difference between a confounder and an effect modifier? This is from Intu Ramachandran.
Okay. So to put it very simply, if you had found that your stratum specific odds ratios were on both sides, on the two sides of the crude odds ratio, you would suspect that it's an effect modifier. If they are on the same side of the crude odds ratio, suspect that it's a confounder. What a confounder does is, it is a third variable which is independently associated with the outcome, and it creates a false relationship between the exposure and the outcome. An effect modifier, on the other hand, is a third variable, say gender, in whose categories, say male and female, the effect is happening, but the effect is happening at different doses or different degrees. That means it is, in both it is showing that the drug is better than placebo, say both male and female. But in males, the drug seems to be acting better than placebo than how much the drug is acting better than placebo amongst the females. That kind of a situation is called an effect modifier. That means effect is happening. There's no doubt about the effect. But there is a third variable according to its different categories, say male and female. The degree of the effect is different depending on whether it's male or female. That is very much unlike a confounder, which is completely distorting the relationship between the exposure and the outcome. To put it briefly, that is the difference between
another question that is actually regarding your talk tomorrow. What is the difference between relative risk and odds ratio? So I hope you'll be answering it tomorrow.
Have some patience.
Yeah.
Unless you are planning not to attend my talk tomorrow.
Okay. So How to, another question was from Nisha Abdul Khader. How to choose a correct alpha value?
Well, you don't have much of a choice. Unfortunately, the convention is a 5% alpha. It will be very difficult for you to say, get a study, publish 7.5% or 5%. So you don't have much of a choice. With beta error, you still have some margin from 20%. You can decrease it to 15 or 10%. So you have a play between 10 to 20%. But alpha error, frankly, you're not left with any choice. It's 5%.
And again, there's one more question from Dr. Radhika, which is already probably answered. Shouldn't stratified or opposite to crude or like in the example to consider it as a confounder? I think you have already answered that twice.
Yeah.
Okay, then there's another question from Pankaj Gulab Rao. How to reduce alpha and beta errors? Again, partially answered.
Yeah. So you don't really reduce them. You assume 5% maximum allowable alpha error. You assume maximum 20% allowable beta error, and then you increase your sample size to be able to detect desired errors.
Yeah. What does one, that's another question from Sandhya Suresh. What does one-sided and two-sided alpha mean, sir? One-sided and two-sided alpha.
Yeah, that's another big topic. Now, see, suppose you have a hypothesis. So let's again take the same dexamethasone versus placebo in COVID pneumonia, right? So the first time you're doing a study, you're starting off from a complete clean slate. You know nothing about how dexamethasone is going to behave, right? So you start off from a null hypothesis that dexamethasone is equivalent to placebo. You are trying to disprove that. Now you don't know in which direction it is going to get disproved. So when you reject the null hypothesis, it may end up that dexamethasone is better than placebo or placebo is better than dexamethasone. It could be either way, right? When you're rejecting the null hypothesis. So your alpha error, that means the possibility of wrongly concluding an association. That means either dexa better than placebo or placebo better than dexa. Both of them are associations. So wrongly arriving at an association when actually there is no difference between the two, that is called alpha error. So that alpha error gets split on the two sides. Your 5% is split into 2.5% on either side. So 2.5% error is on the side that dexa is better than placebo, and 2.5% is on the side that placebo is better than dexa. Okay, because the error could be in either direction when you're rejecting the null hypothesis. Put together, it forms a 5% cumulative combined alpha error. So that is why an alpha error is always two-sided in a superiority trial. It is only in a non-inferiority trial, which I don't have.
Then again, this is regarding one of the slides where the confounding variable was introduced. It's a slightly long question. I'm trying to comprehend it. One of the slides about confounding, where confounding variable was introduced on top of another exposure. That's a red and green rectangle exposed. Am I right? It's a slightly long question, so I think actually like it's better that actually.
Yeah, so those black rectangles are also exposed. The black rectangle in the exposed arm is exposed. The black rectangle in the non-exposed arm is non-exposed.
Okay. Then another question again, Sanjay Narayana. If I increase the range of my p-value in my study from 0.05 to 0.01, how this might change the, it's not 0.001, it's 0.01. How this might change the outcome of my study?
No, are you talking about changing the alpha error, which is something decided at the beginning of the study, or are you referring to p-value?
He said p-value.
No.
Its question is not very clear.
You don't fix p-value in the beginning of the study. The p-value flows from the alpha error. See, the alpha error is what you decide in the beginning of the study. 0.05, and that's how you calculate the sample size. At the end of the study, you get whatever p-value you've got. So suppose p-value is what you get is say 0.01. What does 0.01 mean? You know, one of the biggest problems with p-value is that we express it as decimals. If you convert it into percentage and speak about it in plain English, it makes sense to everybody. So let's make it percentage. So p-value of 0.01 means it is 1%. A p-value of 0.05 means it is 5%. I'm just shifting the decimal places. A p-value of 0.6 means it is 60%. Right? 0.60, that means 60%. That is the probability that the difference that you're seeing could have occurred by random chance. So p-value of 0.01 means there is a 1% probability that the difference that you saw between the two groups could have just occurred by random chance. Right? If you got a p-value of 0.05, it means there is a 5% probability that the difference that you saw could have occurred by random chance. Okay. Now, when we calculate the sample size for an alpha error of 5%, what we are saying is that if the probability that the difference due to random chance drops to less than 5%, we are not going to attribute it to random chance. We are going to say it's a true difference. So p-value of 0.01, that means 1% probability due to random chance. That means that is less than 0.05, or in other words 5%, which is kept as our cutoff. So this is now going to be taken as a true difference, anything less than 0.05. So that's the relationship between alpha error and p-value.
Okay, so that finishes the question.